Hi, hello, and welcome to Rebel Unicorn Crafts. Today, I want to try a kit that I bought myself as a present for Christmas. I've been seeing all sorts of really fun block carving and printing examples, and so I bought myself the Speedball kit to do exactly that. So, let's open this up and see what's in here. Here's the kit that I bought. It comes with a few different things and it was $45 on Amazon. I chose this one because it looked like you had everything you would need to actually get started, and since I didn't have any of the supplies, I figured that was best. So in this kit, there are 4 different inks for the actual printing. There is a black, a blue, a yellow, and a red, so theoretically you could mix colors. And then there is an ink extender, which is supposed to make the ink dry less quickly, so you've got more working time. Also included in this kit is this roller, which is actually used to spread out the ink. It is called a pop-in brayer. There is the lino cutter. It's basically like an X-Acto knife with some different blades for different carving techniques. Mounted linoleum block, which is what will kind of produce the best type of prints from what my research has shown. The pink one is a speedy carving block, which is just kind of like silicone or rubber that's meant to be much easier to actually do carving on, especially when you are a beginner like me. And then the final big metal piece that has kind of the angled bits on it is used to spread the ink on, and it is called an inking plate or a bench hook. There is a booklet with some instructions, as well as on the side of the packaging there are also some different diagrams. We've got our supplies. Now, what do we do with them? I looked through this pamphlet and there's not actually as much information on here as it appears. It's barely a little more information on some of the inks and things like that. There are not really any how-tos. So I did have to do some searching on Google, and I looked for Speedball to see if they specifically had one, and they don't themselves, but Blick did have a Speedball specific kit video which went over in a little bit of detail what to do with this kit. While it did give me a few overviews, here's the actual information I was looking for. I wanted to know what type of design would be wise, as in how bold should lines be, maybe should there be spacing, where would you emphasize lights or darks to get the best type of designs, and then I wanted to know where to begin carving. So should you outline first? How thick should you make sure that your lines are going to be? And also a more comprehensive overview of when you would use the Speedy Carve versus the mounted linoleum. After my research, I did draw up a little design that was about the size of this Speedy Carve or the other block, and that's my little dog Moogie in kind of a cartoon style. So I did a sketch, and then I did really outline those different lines to make sure that I was giving myself a little bit better guidance. And when I drew this up, one of the things that I was kind of curious, and that's what I was searching for answers, was how do I know what areas I should leave dark, and how do I create depth with the different carving things? This being my first stamp making, block printing, carving experience, I didn't really know if my design would work, but I knew I needed to get it onto the block, and this is one thing the instructions do cover. There are 3 different ways to get a design onto the block for you to carve around. 1 is to draw directly on it. 2 is to use some transfer paper like I am using to tape your design over and then press in over the transfer paper to transfer the design. Or there is also an option on how to do this with an ink printer that I did not explore. So after taping down my carbon paper and tracing over everything, here is what I was left with. I'm not exactly sure why, but I was expecting these lines to be cleaner. I was tracing onto rubber, so I should not have expected that. But I decided to, one, try to clean it up with a rubber eraser, and it helped a little bit, but not a whole lot. So I don't know if that's necessary. I then actually trimmed this rubber block because I think I can get a few other little blocks or stamps off of it later. So I trimmed it up to be about the size, and then I took a normal pencil and I retraced over the lines so I had clear guidelines for when I started carving. The lino cutter is just kind of like a fancy X-Acto knife, and one thing that I had a surprising amount of trouble was putting this together in a way where I could put the nib in, and that's because the chuck from the inside had actually fallen out and was just rolling around in that box, and I had set it aside. So if yours has fallen out and you can't figure out how to put it in, look for the little chuck. It's like two little half sides of like a pencil nib kind of a thing with a rounded dome on it. And when you loosen the tool, then you're going to be able to actually create friction and pressure against the nib when you put it in there and then wind it up. So in the base of that lino cutter is going to be different nibs. I went ahead and selected the smallest one possible and installed that. Again, this is the part I really do wish that they had covered in the instructions, but where I decided to start was by carefully outlining and going on the outer parts of each line with this cutter that's kind of a V shape, so it digs kind of a ditch next to the line. And if you change the angle so that you're pushing down when you're making a big line, but when you want to get to the end of line, you swoop it up, you can kind of terminate it before you get to the next line. That seems to help, and I went ahead and I outlined this whole thing really carefully to make sure I got around the outside edges without actually going into the edges, and that was my starting point. Two things that I found helpful during this process was, one, rotating the piece as I was cutting it so that I was working to my advantage of pushing in the directions that I was most comfortable with, making sure to try my best to be really careful when I was pushing towards myself or by moving my hand so that I was not pushing the blade directly towards any of my skin. I didn't hurt myself during this, but there's definitely potential. The second is to actually take out the bits of rubber and remove them from the piece so that they don't get kind of confusing. Here is where it ended up at the end of that process. I wasn't yet sure how I wanted to deal with the inside or brave enough to try to make those thin lines on the inside. So I switched out for the second largest tip, or the one that was a little bit bigger, so that I could carve out away from the body of the stamp and really try to get as much of that away from it as I could so that it wouldn't make an impression when I did print on it. So I went ahead and repeated that process that I kind of did by going around one more time, but with a thicker nib. My head really gets in the way here because I was really concentrating, trying not to ruin this little sketch I had because I didn't want to have to make adjustments. At this point, I had been carving for probably 30 minutes or so. I was going really slow just to try to, I was kind of avoiding moving to the interior part of this, but I decided I'd had enough practice and I should bite the bullet and go ahead and try to get into some of those nooks and crannies, as well as start deciding which ones I was going to keep as raised outlines and then which parts I was going to keep solid so that they would be black blocks. Now, when I did the interior lines, I tried to do the same thing as on the outside outline, but I stayed to the interior side of those graphite lines that are marked out. And while I'm also doing this, I'm kind of starting to keep in mind the fact that my dog is black and I am making a stamp of her, so I don't really want this to just be a straight outline, as well as I want to make sure there are some darker parts, like in the inside of her ears that would be cast in shadow. So I needed to kind of figure out, where am I preserving those dark areas? Because anywhere that I'm carving out now is not going to be shown in the final print. It's going to appear as white or the background of whatever paper I'm using. Ultimately, I decided to outline all parts, and I do wish after printing that there were some parts that I hadn't outlined and I had just kept as a flat space, but that's what I decided to do. I outlined all parts, but I did leave big blocky areas on both the back of her body and on her tail and the insides of the ears. I decided to choose areas where light would hit her, like her face, and completely remove all of the rubber besides the outlines from there so that it would appear lighter. In certain areas where I was leaving big blocks, I did kind of make little swooping parts so that it would kind of look like a little bit of fur, and I tried to feather out areas kind of into the ear so it looked a little more natural. Then I swapped out to the largest V-shaped carving tool I had, and I just set about removing all of the excess pieces and carving away from the body so that just my outline and inner details were going to be standing up and the rest of it would be out of the way. I finished up my carving, and when I was done, it looked a little something like this. I trimmed off some of the excess parts because I realized I was kind of carving certain areas for no reason. And so I trimmed them up a little bit, and then I actually went and washed this off. In my experience, this kit came and some pieces were kind of dusty, and I think it's from the linoleum block. So I did wipe off the plate that I'm going to be using for the ink, but I didn't know what exactly to do about the rolling piece because I didn't want to get it wet to affect the ink. So I used my handy dandy lint roller to remove as much of the lint from it as I could. And then I gathered some paper for printing. I wanted to try a few different things. I'm going to use this watercolor pad. I also have some paper I made a while ago that I think it might look really cool on. And then I am also going to be using a mixed media pad, which is lighter weight than the watercolor, to see which paper it prints best on. Then there wasn't really much left to do but actually try the printing. Unfortunately, again, this is not very clear in the instructions. I wish it were, but from watching a few videos that I've seen and just some of the fun TikTok videos that I watch, what it seems like you do is you just smear the ink kind of across the top, and at first this was runny. I think it had settled out. And then you just roll that ink around until the roller is completely coated. This looks a little bit wet or not fully opaque or caked on, but I went for it anyways, and I put my paper down straight on it and I pushed and rubbed without pushing down so that I wouldn't get any of the creases as best I could, and then pulled it off, and my first little print turned out pretty cute. I do wish that I hadn't done that outline on the back or on the front part of the tail, but in general, I'm pretty impressed by how well this worked for a beginner, a very beginner. The other thing that I didn't think about, it obviously flips your image, and that is super obvious in doing this now. Next, I'm testing the watercolor paper. So this is the smooth side of the watercolor paper, or the less textured one. I had high hopes for this. And it turned out pretty good, but it's still, even though this is the less textured side, you could definitely still see some of the texture seeping through. So we pretty much know what's going to happen with the next one, which is the textured side, but let's go ahead and see. I really tried to load up the stamp or the block, and really push down. I think the real difference, on a side note, between stamping and block printing is stamping, you put the ink down on it, versus this where you put the paper down on the stamp or the block. And yeah, it turned out good, but you could definitely see the texture. So my original thought of putting this on the homemade paper, it is a very textured paper. Yeah, it did not transfer as well as I would have liked, but we gotta try it. And this was actually one of the worst results that I had, but it was interesting to try, and it looks like for the outlines it worked really well, so maybe if you had more of an outline heavy design, that would work pretty well. I'm not quite ready for mixing my own colors or doing any sort of gradients, but I did want to try a different color, so I grabbed the blue because her fur has blue undertones, so I thought it would be a little fitting. And this ink was a lot more thick than the black ink, and again, I don't know if that's just because that black ink settled out more or what the deal was, but I was able to get a pretty good coat. It just took a little more work, and I had already had some of the black on there, but I decided to just go for it just to see. So this should have some black that seeps through, and it should just kind of have some blue to it. I personally liked how the mixed media paper, which is I think 117 pound paper, did best. It was nice and smooth, and with the little bit of blue in there, that turned out super cute, but I want to give it another shot. I actually really like how the blue looks. That blue color is really beautiful. I am curious to see how well these colors blend so I could make my own custom ink colors, but the blue is just beautiful. It's a beautiful shade. The other funny thing that happened that was a little serendipitous on both of these blue ones is there was still a little bit of black left in the interior part of the ears, so it kind of stayed that way, which was kind of a neat extra effect. I had a ton of fun testing with this kit and playing with this. I do recommend the kit. I think it has everything you need to get started, minus helpful instructions. That would be my one piece of feedback, is that ideally they would provide some better tutorial type information in video format or in a handout type format. But I still do recommend this, that you can find all sorts of really good block printing artists on all sorts of platforms that will have very good specific advice on how to get started, or you can just kind of wing it like I did. Either way, I hope that this was helpful in deciding whether or not you want to try out block printing, and I hope that you have a magically creative day. Please let me know in the comments below if you have any questions. I will answer them to the best of my abilities. If you also want to share any information or pictures with me of things you've done, you can do that through Instagram, either at Rebel Unicorn Crafts or at Lacey Walker Art, and I hope that you have a magically creative day.